Welcome back to Learning Japanese History with Y, Episode 4. Last time, we watched the Jomon world transform into the Yayoi world. Migrants arrived, rice farming took root, society stratified. But here's the question I want to sit with today: why did conflict increase? Why did peaceful villages build moats? Why did tools become weapons? The answer is one word: surplus. And by the end of this episode, you'll understand exactly how a bumper rice harvest can, step by step, give birth to chiefs, armies, and political power. This is Episode 4, the causal relationship between surplus production and the birth of power. Let's start with the skeleton, the structural argument we'll be unpacking for the rest of this episode. Look at the pyramid on screen. At the top, surplus product. In the middle, accumulation. At the base, power. The flow goes downward, and it's inevitable once you accept the first step. Step 1. Rice farming produces overproduction. Unlike hunting and gathering, where you consume roughly what you find, wet rice cultivation routinely produces more than a family or village can eat. That excess is surplus food. It can be stored, it can be counted, it can be owned. Step 2. Once there is surplus, the question becomes, who accumulates it, and who manages it? This isn't a neutral question. Whoever controls the surplus controls everything that depends on it. Competition for accumulation begins, not just between individuals, but between villages. Step 3. As competition intensifies, the group or person who can enforce their claim to the surplus, through military force, gains decisive advantage. Rule by force becomes the practical solution to the question of who controls the food. And once that force is organized, it becomes institutionalized. You get chiefs, armies, and the first structures of political power. Surplus product right-pointing arrow accumulation right-pointing arrow power. This is the engine of Yayoi's social transformation. We'll return to this diagram at the end of the episode to confirm that everything we cover traces back to it. So how do we see this playing out in the archaeological and historical record? 3 pieces of evidence stand out. First, population explosion. The slide shows a graph. Japan's population during the Yayoi-period grew from roughly 100,000 to approximately 600,000. That's a 6-fold increase. Why such dramatic growth? Because rice farming is dramatically more calorie efficient than hunting and gathering. A given area of rice paddy can support far more people than the same area of forest. More food means more people survive infancy, more people live longer, and settlements can grow larger. But here's the paradox. More people means more mouths to feed, which drives the need for even more rice production, which requires more land, more water, and more organized labor. Population growth and agricultural intensification feed each other in a cycle. Second, the map shows that rice farming expanded from northern Kyushu, where it first arrived, eastward across Honshu, all the way to eastern Japan. This was not a slow drift. It was a relatively rapid cultural and demographic expansion. As rice farming spread, so did the social structures that came with it: settled villages, grain storage, and the hierarchies that manage both. Third, the archaeological evidence. 3 categories define this period: bronze bells and weapons, both ceremonial and military; moated settlements, villages surrounded by defensive ditches, proof that communities felt threatened enough to invest enormous labor in fortification; and highland settlements, villages relocated to hilltops, which are harder to attack but worse for farming. That trade-off tells you something important: survival mattered more than agricultural convenience. Now let's apply the 3 perspective, why, framework. This is where we move from what happened to why it had to happen this way. Perspective 1. Who benefits? The village leadership layer. These were the men, and occasionally women, who organized agricultural labor, managed grain storage, and coordinated irrigation. Their role was essential to rice farming's success. And because they were essential, they accumulated both material wealth and social authority. Think about the logic. In a hunter-gatherer band, everyone participates in food acquisition roughly equally, so no one person's role is uniquely indispensable. But in a rice farming village, the person who decides when to open the water channels, who manages the granary, who organizes the harvest crews, that person becomes impossible to replace. Their organizational role is their source of power. Managing farmers became a form of value that translated directly into social status. Perspective 2. What changed? The fundamental shift was in time horizon. In the Jomon era, the operative question was, what are we eating today? Resources were consumed close to when they were acquired. There was little reason to plan further ahead than the next season. With rice farming, the operative question became, what seed rice are we protecting for next year? The granary changed everything. Something that can be stored can be planned for. Something that can be planned for can be invested in. And, crucially, something that can be stored can be taken by force, and can be defended. The moment food became storable, it became property. And property is worth fighting over. This structural shift, from today's meal to next year's seed, is the psychological and economic root of conflict. Perspective 3. Why that timing? Population had grown to the point where it exceeded what existing settlement patterns could support. When a growing population competes for a fixed resource base, arable flatland with water access, competition between settlements becomes inevitable. This is sometimes called a Malthusian trap. Population grows until it meets the limits of food production, at which point conflict over resources intensifies. Yayoi Japan hit that ceiling in the middle Yayoi period. Settlements that had coexisted while there was room to expand now found themselves competing for the same river valleys and irrigable plains. That competition produced war. Let's connect this causal logic to the specific archaeological evidence you need for entrance exams. Two types of defensive settlement are the key exam vocabulary. First, moated settlements, in Japanese, kangosen. These are villages surrounded by one or more water-filled ditches, sometimes with wooden palisade walls on the inner bank. The scale of labor required to build these structures is significant. You don't invest that effort unless you have a real, persistent threat to defend against. What does a moat defend? The granary, the stored surplus rice that represents months of food security and years of planning. The moat is not primarily a defense of people, it's a defense of wealth. This is exactly what the slide means when it says, defense of surplus food, evidence of rule by force. The moat makes the causal chain tangible. Second, highland settlements, in Japanese, kochusei shuraku. As conflict intensified, some communities abandoned flat, agriculturally convenient locations and moved their villages to hilltops and ridgelines. Hilltops are difficult to attack. They offer visibility of approaching threats. But they're inconvenient for farming, further from water, harder to till. The fact that communities made this trade-off, accepting worse agricultural conditions in exchange for security, is powerful evidence of how serious inter-settlement conflict had become. Moated settlement, defense in place. Highland settlement, withdrawal to high ground. Together, they paint a picture of a society that had fundamentally organized itself around the threat of war. We've seen how power emerged from surplus. Now let's look at how Yayoi chiefs expressed and legitimized that power, through bronze. Bronze implements in the Yayoi period fall into two geographically distinct categories, and each reveals a different face of power. In the Kinki region, the area around modern Osaka, Kyoto, and Nara, bronze took the form of dotaku, large, ornate bronze bells. These were not musical instruments in any practical sense. They were ceremonial objects used in rituals, most likely to pray for bountiful harvests, protection from disaster, or community well-being. The dotaku represents religious authority. The chief who controls the ritual, who stands between the community and the gods, derives power from sacred legitimacy. This is the soft face of power. Follow me because I speak for forces greater than either of us. In northern Kyushu, closer to the continental source of new technology, bronze took weapon shapes, broad swords, spears, and halberds. These were often too large or too thin to be practical weapons. They were ceremonial versions of weapons, displayed as symbols of military prowess. The bronze weapon represents military authority. Follow me because I can protect you, or because you fear what happens if you don't. Put them together and you have the dual nature of Yayoi power, ritual legitimacy on one side, military force on the other. Chiefs who could combine both, who were both sacred leader and military commander, were the most powerful. This dual structure didn't disappear with the Yayoi period. It echoes all the way to the emperor-shogun division of authority in medieval Japan, and arguably beyond. Now let's zoom all the way out. The pattern we've traced in Yayoi Japan isn't unique to Japan. It's a universal structural law of human organization. The formula, surplus resources right-pointing arrow accumulation right-pointing arrow institutionalization right-pointing arrow birth of power. In Japanese history, the Yayoi case, this looks like settlement of rice paddies, generation of surplus rice, and the rise of Uji chiefs and eventually kings. In world history, the parallel case is Mesopotamia, the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, often called the cradle of civilization. There, the surplus resource was wheat. The organizational problem of managing wheat irrigation at scale produced the world's first bureaucracies, the first writing systems, which were essentially accounting records for grain, and the first formalized kingship. The mechanism is identical, the crop is different, the geography is different, but the structural logic is the same. Surplus creates inequality of accumulation, inequality creates competition, competition produces power structures. And here's the contemporary connection the slide highlights. In the modern digital economy, the surplus resource is data. Platform companies, search engines, social networks, e-commerce platforms, accumulate data at enormous scale, use it to generate competitive advantages, and leverage those advantages into economic and political power. The monopoly by platform companies is the Yayoi chief in a server farm. This isn't a perfect analogy, but the structural rhyme is worth taking seriously. History doesn't repeat exactly, but the patterns recur with striking regularity. Before we close, here are 3 prompts to try with an AI to deepen your thinking. These are calibrated to test structural understanding, not just factual recall. Prompt 01, Comparison and Analysis. Compare power emergence from surplus production in the Yayoi-period with modern digital divide society, and identify 3 common patterns in power structure. This forces you to apply today's framework to contemporary reality, the hardest and most valuable kind of historical thinking. Prompt 02, Exam Preparation. How are moated settlements and highland settlements questioned in entrance exams? Explain each, including the cause and effect for why they were built. This is practice for the exact type of exam question you're likely to face. Not just, what is a moated settlement, but, why did it exist and what does it tell us? Prompt 03, Deepening and Application. Does the structure, scarcity of resources creates competition, and competition creates power, apply to modern society? Discuss, including counterarguments. The inclusion of counterarguments is key. History that can only be argued in one direction isn't well understood. Try all 3. The third one is genuinely open-ended. There's no textbook answer. We've come full circle. The slide on screen is the same skeleton we opened with, and that's deliberate. Surplus product, accumulation, power. Does this chain feel different now than it did at the start of the episode? It should. We filled it with real evidence. Population data, archaeological sites, bronze objects, settlement patterns, and cross-civilizational parallels. The bottom line of this slide says it plainly: surplus is the starting point of rule. That sentence is worth committing to memory, not because it appears on exams, although it will, but because it gives you a tool for understanding how power works, not just in ancient Japan, but everywhere. Wherever you see a ruling class, ask, what is the surplus they control? In Yayoi Japan, it was rice. In feudal Europe, it was land. In industrial capitalism, it was capital. In the digital economy, it's data. The crop changes. The structure doesn't.